Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Arthur's Roundtable. Super grateful for everybody being here and paying attention, and the Family Office Insights community who has kindly shared this with a lot of their network. And so we're really, really grateful for you guys listening to us here. Um, Gene and I met at a Park City entrepreneur event, Tribe Angels, I think it was.
Mhm.
And he's been kind to me in a variety of ways, and he has a very interesting history and background in business. So I'm super grateful also for him to come on, and I'm going to butcher the name, even though I just tried it. Podsiadlo. Good. Say it right.
Right. Podsiadlo is the way we pronounce it now.
Podsiadlo.
Podsiadlo, four easy syllables, and it's on my LinkedIn where you push a little speaker button and you can hear me say it. So
That's so cool. It's like
yeah,
Google Translate, right?
yeah,
Yes.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So, Gene, you've had a storied history in the traditional finance business. You have interesting. I happen to know you like being in the wilderness and have a farm in various places. But let's start with your origin story, a little journey. How did all this come about?
Yeah, well, it's a peripatetic journey, that's for sure. A lot of interesting little chapters and sub journeys, but the basics. I was born in upstate New York, and family of six children, three boys, three girls. And my father was an early memory guy in the computer industry, back in the days of, mainframes before the PC was even thought of. So, he essentially moved around a lot. So as children, one of the defining elements that's made me sort of a world traveler now and not afraid to go sort of anywhere is every 2 years we moved as children, and sometimes even in the middle of the year, the school year. So I got very used to being the new kid, and we were joking about pronouncing my last name, but I remember distinctly moving to Colorado from New York State after we'd been in Massachusetts, and the kids all saying, "Well, Gene, that's a girl's name."
Right, right.
So I thought to myself, well, my last name was tough enough, but now
You've got to
now
deal with that too.
I gotta deal with my first name anyway. So, essentially, I grew up. My mother was a elementary school teacher, so education was valued. My father was the first of his family and only to go to college, Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in Troy, New York,
Yeah,
RPI, as an
I know it.
electrical engineer.
Yeah.
Was a Navy guy for a couple, whatever the requirement was. But anyway, essentially, we grew up in a family where with six kids, especially in the era I grew up in, you were pretty much left to
Your own devices.
your own desires and demons, I guess. I became a musician. So I was a classically trained trumpet player. In fact, that started in Colorado, remember? And, then I got into guitars and bass guitar and, the world of rock music. So I was in a lot of bands as a young teenager. Did pretty well. I never had to have a summer job because we made money playing all sorts of places up and
Nice.
down the East Coast. Back in those days, you could actually play in clubs if you were under the age of 18 or 21.
Right.
So I did. So I became very street smart, dealing with some of these club owners and bar owners and all that kind of stuff. But, I really thought music was gonna be my thing, and my late mother was a little bit of a typecaster and kind of encouraged it, and one day when it was time to apply for college, this is after my older brother, 1 year older, who was one of these guys who was a double 800 SAT kid without even studying. He got a full ride to Cornell as a merit scholar, and I had no idea where I wanted to go to college other than, I was going to go to music school. So I was looking at the Berkeley School of Music and, all these other things. And my mother said, well, why don't you? The one thing I knew living at that point, just outside of Princeton, New Jersey, in a little farm town, public high school, and my graduating class was 100 kids. I just knew I wanted to get out of kind of rural life. I was used to New York City and, all that other stuff. So my mother said, why don't you take a trip down to University of Pennsylvania? It's in Philadelphia. And I didn't know a lot about Philadelphia. So I took a train down there and I loved the grittiness of West Philadelphia and sort of fell in love with that campus and thought, okay, this I could see working. So, I applied. Some of the viewers are going to just laugh at this, and please don't think I'm low IQ for having had this attitude as a 17-year-old, but I thought I was going to the University of Pennsylvania for music. My mother kind of, you
She
know,
faked you out, right?
yeah, she faked me out. And so I get there, I'll never forget it, the quadrangle of University of Pennsylvania on Spruce Street. And I get my course list and it's, finance and accounting. And well, it turns out I was in the Wharton School undergrad,
Yeah.
which was the
Wow.
oldest Wharton School, by the way.
Yeah.
We're very sensitive about that.
Yeah.
The MBA program came much later, but the original Wharton School was an undergraduate, still is School of Business. Many of the professors are the same. And I went to the counselor. I said, well, where are the music courses? They said, you could take some electives, later on, but, you have to take these courses. So I marched off. I had no idea about any of this stuff. I'd been a good student in high school.
Well,
And
you got into the Wharton School. That's like a big deal.
well, yeah, I mean, today I never would.
Yeah.
When I look back on it, I remember in the interview, the guy was very interested in sort of the business side of me playing music and stuff. And I was able to talk pretty good about that. I think he was sort of impressed with sort of the entrepreneurship of being in a band and a musician. So anyway, long story short is I got transformed. I had hair down to here. I still got kind of long hair. And my whole life changed going through 4 years of the Wharton School and graduating with a bachelor's in science and economics. Lawrence Klein, one of the Nobel Prize winners, was my economics professor. Jeremy Siegel, who's on
Jeremy
CNBC.
Siegel's still
Yeah,
making showings on CNBC and
yeah.
otherwise.
He was my finance professor.
Yeah, crazy.
Anyway, so long story short is I did that, and just to not to drag my resume out too long here, I'll be a little briefer. But that was, you think of the transformative events of your life. That was certainly probably the biggest for me because I don't know what would have happened to me. I'd probably be playing in some wedding band somewhere
Right, right. Yeah.
instead of having been on Wall Street, financial services, much of my career. But anyway, I ended up. The deal in my family was you got your undergraduate uh, uh, tuition paid for. You had to earn your own spending money, but then you were on your own. So I sort of shopped around for the best deal I could find for MBA school because I'm dating myself now, but I graduated in 1979 from Wharton undergrad, and the economy was terrible. Everybody who's over a certain age remembers 18% interest rates,
Totally.
and Reagan and Paul Volcker were really not having their effect quite yet. So I didn't have the connections that a lot of my classmates did. You know, I went to school with some very sophisticated, famous kids from New York and LA and some other places. Learned a lot from them, but I decided I'd go straight to MBA school. And so I went to University of Maryland at College Park. One of my best friends, by the way, there was none other than Carly Fiorina.
Hewlett Packard name.
Carly Bartlam was her name. I'm named in the unauthorized biography, which is called Backfire, I think.
Mhm.
She and I were great pals. Anyway, I was the president of my class. I really sort of flourished more in Oh, a broader business way. I was a TA at first. That was part of the deal to get the tuition paid for. And, real quick story, I ran into some engineers who were sort of literally at a local watering hole in College Park, sort of crying over their beer about the fact that they had just lost a contract or were going to lose a contract with the Federal Express Corporation because they found out that as a state university, any research done through the university, through the Office of Sponsored Programs, because it was a state facility, had to be published. And Federal Express said, no, no, no. If we're going to spend a couple $1 million on what was avionics instrumentation for the early FedEx aircraft,
They need to own it. Yeah.
yeah, they need NDAs. It's got to be confidential, and that wasn't allowed. So I innocently said to these guys, "Well, why don't you just start a company?"
Right.
And they said, "Well, these were aeronautical engineers." They were like, "Well, how do you do that?" I said, I'm a business student. I went to the Wharton School. I know how to do that." And uh, the next thing you know, not only did we form a company, it was originally called Flight Research Group because the only client was FedEx. I met Fred Smith and Al
Nice.
McCarter, who was later head of the FAA. Essentially, what we did was create a private company. And ironically enough, there was excess office space on the University of Maryland campus. So we actually entered into a commercial lease to rent space on campus. So we were a private corporation on campus. So all the professors could just walk across the street to our offices and do their thing. And very quickly, other people we ran into throughout the university had the same issue. So we ended up, long story short, we ended up naming it University Research Group. And, we had dozens of contracts from different areas of the university, where there was the same issue. They needed a private contract, thing. So in a way, it was an early
Early form of an
technology.
incubator, right?
Yeah, kind of a technology transfer, early incubator concept. And, things went really great. I managed all the money, which kind of led to the next portion of my career. But what I'm really proud of is we ended up transferring the company because I sort of lost interest after a while to the 501c3 foundation, which was called the University of Maryland Foundation. So it's now called University Research Foundation in Greenbelt, Maryland. It's still there, and it still does exactly the same thing. It's a multi-million-dollar, contract letting enterprise with the same model. It is off campus now, but it's the same model. So that was a formative experience as well because I I I started my own business and I was not afraid going forward to be an entrepreneur. So anyway, long story short, I ended up going to work for the firm where uh, I used all their money market funds to manage the cash of the corporation. It's a company called Calvert Group down in Bethesda, Maryland, and had a nice little career there. Then I got recruited up to Citicorp, went to New York into one of their associate programs. Real quick, I ended up running a division or two of Citicorp brokerage and launching several investment products for the bank because all the banks were starting to do that. And then I had a huge staff, huge responsibility. Banks didn't pay anything like traditional Wall Street. This was the John Reed days, for those of you who remember the
Yeah.
former CEO before the whole Wall Street
Sandy
invasion of
Weil.
Citibank. So I decided to leave, and I was actually going to take a job in Pittsburgh with PNC Bank, much bigger job. And at the last second, I got a call from a headhunter. And by the way, I was always starting these little companies. Some of them failed or got nowhere, but a couple of them had some traction, and I would make a little bit of money selling them off, all in New York City. And at the last second, I got a call from a headhunter who said, "Hey, do you know the venture capital firm Warburg Pincus?" And I said,
You were in New York.
I,
Of course you
I
knew.
presented I presented to them
Yeah.
with one of my ideas because that was back in the day. when they really weren't such a PE firm as they are today. They still did early stage stuff back in those days. And I went and interviewed with Lionel Pincus, who was again probably one of the most influential people in my life, who based on a handshake said, "Hey, I have a little asset management business that sits next to the venture capital business where we manage public equities for the likes of Doris Duke and some of the institutions and foundations who are in the venture capital partnerships. And it's not making money. I'd like somebody to see if they can do something." I said, "Oh, I know what we could do with it." And he said, "Really?" And I said, "Yeah, I know exactly what I'd do." And he goes, "Well, could you write, don't spend too much time on it, but over the weekend, could you write a little couple pager on what you do?" And I did, and a little roughed out budget. And I presented it to him. He loved it. And essentially my idea was to form the Warburg Pincus funds, mutual funds. This is 1989,
Yeah, like
1990,
Zodiac funds.
40 funds.
Yeah.
My whole concept was I learned this at Citibank, because Citibank was infiltrated before the Wall Street crew showed up in the John Reed days. They were infiltrated by the likes of Rick Braddock, who went on to bigger and better things in the travel industry and some other things, but they all came from General Foods. And I learned a ton about the consumer product,
Mm.
marketing elements that could be applied to financial services. In fact, I remember one of my second or third bosses at Citibank was the former Alpo dog food product manager, and I had to explain what a basis point was. And anyway, long story short, I created the Warburg Pincus funds on the theory that we could. I showed Lionel Pincus that spending just a little bit of money puts you virtually in the top 10 advertisers in the mutual fund world. Because back in those days, Fidelity and T. Rowe Price did it, but
Vanguard. Yeah.
there weren't a lot of others. And then, as luck would have it, is I was early to say, there's a shortage of actively managed international equity funds. There were hardly any. And so I recruited some people. We had one guy in house who was quite talented. We formed a suite of those funds, and then we were one of the first 10 mutual funds on the Schwab platform, the so-called supermarket era of mutual fund distribution. Fidelity did it shortly thereafter, but we were early. And in the early days, you had to be sort of picked or somehow otherwise get yourself onto the list. It's pretty much an automatic now. You just have to pay an ongoing fee to those marketplaces. That, by the way, I'll get to that later. That's going away with ETFs. But in the traditional mutual fund business, it quickly became very important to get on those marketplaces for both retail, and then very quickly, as everybody on this call I'm sure knows, Schwab and Fidelity, along with Pershing and some other later entrants, became the oligopoly, if you will, of RIA custodianship. So registered investment advisors to this day, Schwab, Fidelity,
Not Pershing.
Pershing, TD Ameritrade. So we were early, and it was worth billions of dollars in AUM. Going back to my reference to not being afraid to travel and live places, I wanted to prove that I could. We got to $10 billion in AUM, and I wanted to prove that I could do it anywhere. So we had a really great Japanese equity guy, a Brit actually, who spoke fluent Japanese. And I said, let's go to Tokyo. And I've been reading about some bank deregulation coming up where instead of just the brokerage firm selling funds, banks in Japan were going to be able to sell funds. So it was a sort of a long and interesting slog to get the regulatory stuff set up. But ironically, uh, I went over there to Tokyo. We were right across from the Imperial Palace with Chip Kay, who's the current CEO now of Warburg Pincus Ventures. And I basically replicated everything I did in the United States in Japan, only in Japanese. I
Wild,
hired a bunch of,
Wild West, Wild East, right?
yeah, yeah. And I had pictures of our portfolio manager with all the Japanese words underneath in all the subway stations, and we did lots of advertising and publicity and tons of road shows to banks, and many of the banks were very anxious to get something different than what the Nikos and the other the Daiwas had. So we made a pretty big splash. So we grew fairly quickly, and Credit Suisse saw all this. They were over there, and they had a mutual fund business, a bigger private wealth business, but a mutual fund business that hadn't grown as fast. And they basically, couldn't figure out how we did this. And they approached me and said, would you consider doing a joint venture with us in Tokyo? So I said, sure. So I still have the magazine or the newspaper announcement somewhere where I became co-CEO of a joint venture with Credit Suisse in Tokyo.
Wild.
And, I had some success with them, but very quickly they so liked the overall business that we had both in the US, and I had simultaneously done a group of UCITS in Dublin and what we'd done in Tokyo that it just so happened that it was right around the time that Lionel Pincus had reached an age where I think he wanted to retire. So Credit Suisse actually approached Lionel Pincus and asked if he would consider selling the asset management division and some portion of the venture business. So at virtually the peak before the dot com collapse, that is, December of 1999, we signed an LOI and term sheet to sell Warburg Pincus Asset Management to Credit Suisse. And I was the sort of fair-haired boy running back and forth to Zurich. Lucas Muleman was the CEO of Credit Suisse back in those days. Ironically, there was a big breakup fee, of course. Ironically, the deal closed on April 30th. And of course, that was after the great April 15th
Yeah.
beginning
Bust.
of the NASDAQ collapse
Yeah.
in 2000. But they went ahead. We had an earnout that was indexed. We ended up negotiating a one-time buyout, but it was a fantastic deal because that was probably the peak of both pre-fee compression in the mutual fund business. Even though we were quite competitive, I really believed in being on the lower end of active fund management fees. Um, but essentially, Credit Suisse, acquired 100% of Warburg Pincus Asset Management. They acquired a small piece of ventures, and the rest was sort of history. I stayed on for 2 years with the executive committee of Credit Suisse, but I quickly disliked the bureaucracy of Credit Suisse compared to the private partnership that we were at Warburg Pincus. So I left. And long story short, I went with a firm who had tried to recruit me called Wasatch Global, which is how I got to Utah. They're an institutional and mutual fund manager in Salt Lake City, and one of the partners whom you know, Arthur, Carrie Barker,
Yeah.
a 30-year now friend of
Super nice.
mine.
Super
She
smart.
she had
Super nice.
the she had the foresight after .com between Reg FD and the Spitzer Accords and all the regulation that came out. Her hypothesis way back then in sort of 0102 was that private companies would stay private longer. And when she gives her stump speech now, she talks about that, and she said, I had no idea how correct I would be, because of course companies do stay private, if not for a long time, in some cases forever. They
Right.
don't want to go public.
Yeah.
Some of it was just the friction of all that regulation, the cost. And the other thing that happened was, there was a lot of money in the world, and a lot of it, whether you want to thank Dave Swenson at Yale or whatever, there was, a big shift in pie charts to private securities and alternatives, whether it was venture capital or private equity. There's so many more categories now, of course. But
Everybody thought
anyway, we
they were saying
formed
something.
a
They
firm
thought
called Cross Creek.
Right.
Cross Creek Venture Capital, which the website's crosscreek.vc. And today it's still a boutique, but carries specialties late stage VC. Some people would call it pre-IPO when IPOs were happening more often. But as many people on this call know, much of the alpha creation that occurs with companies now happens before
For.
the
Yeah.
IPO. So if you don't have an allocation, if you're just investing in small cap publicly traded companies or micro cap for that matter, you're probably missing, a huge piece of the hockey stick valuation run up for the successful companies. We saw that with SaaS. We saw that with, all sorts of different verticals. So Carrie has a great business, and I was an advisor there for several years. I was on the investment committee, but I wandered off. And now, just to bring it forward, and then I'll let you ask some more questions.
No, no.
Um,
See,
I I'm affiliated, or I'm an advisor in special limited with a firm called AI Capital. It's AI.vc, which gives you a sense of how early this group of MIT people were. They all came out of the AI lab at MIT. I always say to them, the domain name AI.vc is probably worth a ton of money.
a ton of money, especially now. And when we met with her,
Yes.
it was at the beginning of ChatGTP. I
Yeah.
mean, it hadn't
Oh,
even
yeah.
happened of note yet, right?
That's
AI
right.
was happening, but ChatGTP wasn't happening, right?
That's right. That's
Etcetera.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was Elizabeth Cook. Yeah, yeah, we met in Park City. That's right. Yeah, no, these people, have deep resumes in machine learning and AI in what we call applied AI. So that's pretty much what the company does now. I can't talk too much about it, but we're from a concept fund one. They're now, I think, going to be raising a fund too. There's a couple. There's been some very nice exits, and there's some pending. But their whole thing is they don't do B2C. Everything's B2B. Tends to be, by definition, enterprise software using AI elements that solve big problems. They're not interested in little niche businesses, not interested in consumer, has nothing to do with chatbots. So they really, because of their history in actually building software as entrepreneurs before they decided to go into the venture business, they really understand some of the trends. So they were very early to things like data. We have a very valuable company in the medical patient records database arena. There was a cover story several years ago that showed Google and a couple other companies, Meta, back in those days, Facebook, and it said data is the new gold.
Yeah.
And it's true. I mean, what everybody on this call I think knows is, number one, you have to be careful with your data, because if you just, in the early days, we all read articles about engineers putting proprietary data into Chat GPT without realizing that that was
It
going to be
became
used.
public
And
domain,
that's right. So, enterprise AI, whether it's OpenAI or some of the
a
other
closed
firms.
LLM, whatever, whatever,
Yeah,
right?
that's right. But
Yeah.
you need to control your data. So they understand all that stuff. So they're really fun to work with. As an advisor, it's been great. The other thing I'm doing right now is I'm on the board of a company that I helped get going when I first got to Warburg Pincus. It's been transformed by one of my former partners. It's called the RBB Fund. It's what's known as a series trust, which is now got 35 different investment advisors. Essentially, it's the low cost provider for investment advisors to launch originally traditional mutual funds, but now ETFs. And there's something called 351 exchange. 351 exchanges that some on the call might be familiar with. That's something that was one of the first. RBB was one of the first platforms, 40 Act Series Trust, to do a 351 exchange, which provides essentially a way for the creation baskets behind ETFs to eliminate unrealized cap gains in a separate account.
So basically, you can not have to sell an ATF, have a taxable event, and move it to another one.
Well, I'm going to give you a really broad brush. Essentially, the way it works is there's several tests that have to be met, but one of them is uh, it can only be done once, and it can only be done in the formation of a new ETF. So
Thus
it's not like you
theory of
can
the
say, "Oh, we have an ETF, bring your money in," and you actually have to, and if you're going to manage a 40 Act fund, you have to be a federally registered RIA. You can actually create an exchange traded fund. And the other requirement is, of course, it's exchange traded. It has to be available to everyone. It can't be some sort of private vehicle. But there are plenty of people that have a separate account business. This was certainly true at Wasatch, for example. Certainly true at Warburg Pincus. Besides mutual fund clients, you have separate account clients. I'm sure many of the wealth advisors on this call know that dichotomy. So, many of these RAAs have some core strategies, model portfolios on the SMA side of the fence, and they have some, especially in the tech sector over the last decade or two, some monster unrealized cap gains, and this has become something quite that's captured the fancy of a lot of people. So, anyways, it's interesting. I'm on the board of that
So is
of
that
that.
what catalyzed your comment saying that the marketplaces for mutual funds are going to be replaced by ETFs?
Well, essentially, right now, there's also speculation at the moment. I may not be super current on this because I'm not in the distribution business. Uh, the right now, whether it's even Vanguard with their brokerage accounts or Fidelity or Schwab, ETFs have no commission. They offer commission-free trading. So the feeling has been that they will move to a model. I'm not sure they've done it yet. They will move to a model where they're going to ask for a basis point fee, just like they did years ago with mutual funds.
Yeah, that's
But at the
interesting.
moment, I'm not sure they have. People on this call may know better than me, but
Yeah.
ETFs, ETFs, as everyone probably knows, are way more tax efficient by virtue of this in-kind creation of creation baskets for acquisition and the disruption of the basket by market makers for redemptions. That process, really was quite revolutionary. I could tell you a really funny story about that.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I was at Warburg Pincus, and what some people don't realize is exchange traded funds are actually exchange traded open end investment companies. They're open end mutual funds. There's no limit to the number of shares that can be produced, but they're exchange traded. So you do have to get approved not just by the investment company division of the SEC, but by the exchange division of the SEC. Among the elements you must have in offering a 40 Act company is there has to be a legal broker dealer distributor. And, people may be familiar with several of them. One of the largest is called ACA Foreside, but it really almost any broker dealer can perform the function of being the distributor of a mutual fund or an ETF. I mean, there's real responsibilities and
It's
regulatory
oversight, compliance, so on and so forth, right?
compliance, yeah, and related to everything from the advertising rule and all sorts of other things. But anyway, since there needed to be a distributor, this is in the category of what some people call the Hall of Shame, which is the deals you didn't do that you
Right.
should have. So here I was at Warburg Pincus building a big business. I had moved the Warburg Pincus funds custodianship to State Street because State Street to this day, maybe with Bank of New York and Brown Brothers being close behind now, but back in the day, State Street really had the best global sub custodian network. So if you were going to do an emerging markets fund, you couldn't do it with some of the domestic custodians because they didn't have
The
global
reach.
network that State Street did. So anyway, I knew the State Street people. So one day they called up and said, "Hey, we're going to be in town. We got an interesting proposition for you." I said, "Okay, come on in." And they came in, it was a slightly different group that I work with. And they said, we're launching something we're calling the Spider family, which are exchange traded funds, SPDR 500 and all the other stuff. Like they were talking about just one or two to get started. And they said, we need a 40 Act distributor. And we had an in-house broker dealer. I was the securities principal of that at Warburg. And I said, yeah, well, we have a broker dealer. We act as our own distributor in-house. And they said, well, we'd like to see if you'd like to be the distributor for the State Street, these things called exchange traded funds. And I knew a little bit about what had been written about what exchange traded funds were. And I remember thinking, I can't imagine this is going to be that big a deal.
Yeah, but Gene, also with a company even at that point the size of State Street, they could have just spun up a broker dealer or bought one, right?
Yeah, well, that was the strange thing, but I think part of it was a lot of these. The one thing I've learned in financial services, a lot of companies that are in, let's call it the service vendor side of the business, are afraid to invade new
The
areas because
distribution. Yeah, make it look like they're in the
they're afraid
distribution.
that th-
Yeah.
they'll
Channel
they'll be
conflict.
stepping on the they'll be
Yeah.
clients. So anyway, they came to us, and here's the Hall of Shame part. They said, and I said, well, if we did this, what kind of fee are you talking about? And it's much lower now, but they said, well, we were thinking something in the 6 or 7 basis point range. And I said, well, let me get back to you. And I
That
remember
was the end of that. Yeah,
I went
right.
home and I was like, nah, I'm not going to do this. It's too
Yeah,
much
right.
distraction. And I think now, oh my God, how many hundreds of billions
And
are
spiders.
in those things at State Street alone, and I could have been making 6 basis points on that. It's like, in fact, somebody told me the guy who did it. I'm not sure if it was Merrill Lynch. Somebody told me the story that the guy who actually said yes when he retired was actually able to work into his retirement package that he got a forever trail of a piece of that. And I thought to myself, that guy's sitting on a beach somewhere counting his money, and I
Just
said
keeps
no.
on coming in. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's I'll never forget that one. That's the
No,
Hall of Shame.
yeah, I can't even tell you the countless number of those I've had. Um,
Yeah, we all have. Yeah.
wish I did. What about, have you seen this is sort of a curiosity question for me because I've seen a fair amount of activity with the resurrection through, I think it's Blue Owl and others, BlackRock doing uh, interval funds
Yes.
to help non-accredited investors get access to private deals, right? Is you seeing any of that?
Yeah. Well, Blue Owl, I think, is a BDC, business development company, which was a subset of the 40 Act. I was on a BDC board back in the day that Ares Capital bought. The interval funds I'm very familiar with because they're a little close. They're a little more close to a traditional mutual fund. It's just that they can do illiquids like venture capital companies. Kathy Wood, just to name one famous manager, has the ARC investment venture fund, whatever it's called. And essentially they do a quarterly tender offer at a calculated NAV for these.
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah. And they do a quarterly tender offer. So there's a liquidity mechanism. It's not daily, but it's quarterly. And yeah, more and more people are doing those. They haven't been, by my estimation, they haven't been as popular as I would have guessed. Some of them don't have particularly great performance. Everything in the money management business, everybody knows this, does boil down to performance and hopefully consistent performance. Everybody has a bad year here and there, but if there's consistent performance, money tends to follow. So yeah, we'll see. I do think exchange traded funds. I just read that BlackRock was trying to put together, a private equity index because everybody's trying to figure out some other way to allow retail people to get access to, more of these private and alternative asset classes. So I think that may be more the way it happens.
And then there's the work being done to redefine what an accredited investor is, not based on how much money you have, but how sophisticated you might be, right?
Yep. 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 Well, the first way they did that was if you hold a securities license, I think virtually of any stripe, that qualifies you regardless of your net worth or annual income. Yeah, I mean, and then of course everybody's talking about 401ks and the introduction of potentially privates, and some people would argue that is that the sign of a top when
Yeah.
Wall Street tries to start pushing an asset class on retail.
Right.
Who knows?
Who knows?
I think in general, it's going to boil down to the fiduciaries of plans, the trustees, who are going to have to make these difficult decisions about what kinds of asset classes they're going to include on their menu, because they have DOL liability as fiduciaries to make you know good decisions in that department. So we'll see.
Well, see, is right. And there's a lot of activity where private equity is buying AUM firms because the recurring revenue produces a good multiple.
Yep,
And it's sticky business because it's not easy to go from one registered investment advisor or broker dealer to another. As a client, it's
exactly.
kind of like, I'm not going through that. Let's go play golf, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, steady, consistent cash flow is, besides Warren Buffett liking it, I think the rest of the world has discovered that, there's nothing like it, whether it's, even at the micro level, if you will. I mean, people are talking about what occupations will AI eliminate, and everybody's sort of saying, well, if you're a plumber or electrician, you're going to be fine.
Yeah, totally fun.
I mean, if you use your hands, but in some ways, those, yeah, and they grow to be bigger companies. But even if you're just an individually licensed electrician, you're your own boss. You have a predictable cash flow once you get some sort of reputation, and there's a relative shortage of these people. So
And it's hard to imagine that we're going to have a robot plumber crack under the sink, right?
yeah,
It's not likely, right?
no. I
Yeah.
mean, I like to tell people, I think there's going to be many examples of AI enhanced occupations and tasks. But whether there's complete elimination,
Yeah.
it depends. There are going to be entry level positions that I think are much skinny down. I do feel sorry for young
Junior
people
analyst.
getting out of college. Yeah, if you want to
You're a
go become
junior analyst,
yeah, the analyst. I mean, you don't need a whole month to do a DCF spreadsheet.
right?
It's like, so the world is changing, but we'll see.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's quite interesting.
So I
Yeah.
really appreciate you doing this. So I didn't know a lot of that story. I knew some of it. But I brought up, you don't know this, but I brought up my kids in Villanova. I know the
Okay.
White
Okay.
Dog. I know the whole thing down there.
Yeah,
I
the
have
whole
lots of friends that
Philadelphia. Yeah.
went to Wharton, spent a lot of time in Philadelphia, moved to New York City, almost 30 years ago now. But,
Yeah.
that was my stomping ground down there for
Yeah.
sure.
Oh, that's amazing. Well, Villanova's a phenomenal school.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I was 5 minutes away from this campus. I had no business being in that neighborhood, but I had exited a company and bought a house near Pat Croce. Remember Pat?
Okay.
Yeah,
Sure. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
and, just it was an epic place to bring up kids. My kids went to Episcopal Academy. I was a member of
Sure.
Marion and Philadelphia Country Club and blah, blah, blah.
Main line. Yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
the whole main line thing going. Yeah,
Yeah. No, it's a beautiful. All those towns are beautiful, and Philadelphia is again one of those cities on the East Coast that it just, for all the booms we've had, whether it was .com or the '90s, whatever. Philadelphia itself still is, it's never really boomed quite the way other East Coast towns did. We all know that's changing again now. Who knows what's happening with a lot of the large cities these days? But the Philadelphia suburbs were always amazing.
it was just fantastic to bring up
Yeah,
kids there.
yeah,
It
that's
was,
great. Well, I didn't know that.
yeah,
That's
really
wonderful.
civilized.
Yeah, it's very, very well. They good transportation and train systems, and SEPT is kind of a basket case these days, but
Totally.
I can
Yeah,
tell you. But
totally.
anyway,
Yeah,
well,
it was
that's
fun.
great. No, I appreciate you having me, and
It was amazing. Yeah.
yeah,
When you
thanks.
get back, when you head back, it's finally snowing here in Park City.
Yeah.
So get back up here and we'll share a
Yeah,
meal.
I heard I left on this business trip. It's now been extended, but I left just as that storm was hitting. Was that last Wednesday? I think. Yeah. So, but yeah, we certainly needed the snow in Park City, and they got it, I guess. Right?
Yeah, so they got enough for the Alta and Snowbird and, Park City Mountain and Deer Valley to just take a breath, right? Because
Yes.
they were just wailing in the streets, It was like, "Holy cow, is it ever gonna snow?"
Yeah.
So I think they're gonna get a base and easier to make snow, right? So people are feeling better. There's no question
Yeah.
about it.
That's
Of
good.
course, beautiful, of course.
I'll be back in a week or so.
All right, sounds good. Gene, thanks for doing this.
Well,
Super
thanks, Arthur.
appreciate it. Yeah, that
Really
was fun.
appreciate it.
Yeah, we'll do it again soon. Okay?
Good afternoon to you.
You
Okay.
too. Thanks
Bye now.
everybody for tuning in. Take
Thank
care.
you.